Good evening. There's quite devastation in this community here in Southport tonight, as it has been dealt the most devastating blow today.
Back on the 29th of July, a mass stabbing took place at a Taylor Swift-themed dance class in Southport.
Police called a ferocious stabbing attack at a dance workshop.
3 children ultimately lost their lives: BB King, Elsie Stancombe and Alice De Silva Aguiar. 10 others were injured, and of those, 8 of them were children. The very next day, riots took place. A mosque was targeted. The reason for that was misinformation, specifically about the attacker's identity, nationality and religion being published online. And as that misinformation spread, so too did the riots. We were seeing violence in the streets of Aldershot, Manchester, Liverpool, Sunderland, Hartlepool, Portsmouth, Belfast and elsewhere. I'm Niall Paterson, and on today's Sky News Daily, we're going to be joined by our data and forensics correspondent, Tom Cheshire. Now, he was in Bristol reporting on the riots that took place there soon after the 29th of July. And since that day, he's been looking into the root causes of the riots, the misinformation that took people to the streets in their thousands, and where exactly it came from. And Tom is back in the studio. Tom, just take us back to that day in Bristol. What did you see there? Because I'll be brutally honest with you, it was incredibly scary.
Yeah, it was a big protest. I mean, it came out of nowhere. It was on that day when there had been lots of protests. This list had been circulating on Telegram. Bristol was one of those, and we went down there. There were 2 sides opposite each other, and they were staying apart, and then suddenly all hell broke loose. Police started charging. This was up on the top of the hill in Bristol. It's sort of running battles all the way down.
Running battles?
Yeah, there were people, punches being thrown, skirmishes. The counter-protesters had the top of the hill, and it looked very medieval, really. And that kept taking place. It went down to the bridge where there was a standoff between protesters and police. That's when it got more violent, bottles being thrown. I got one in the head, was wearing a helmet. So
you got hit?
Yeah, just it was a bit of a surprise more than anything. But
I bet it was.
I had PPE, personal protective equipment on, so it was fine. And that continued all through the evening, all the way up out of Bristol, outside an asylum centre, where the counter-protesters were again. Eventually, it did die down and fizzled out. But I think what was really interesting about Bristol is, especially when it was lining up, it's not like you would look at the people protesting and say, this is the far right. And we had quite quickly, Keir Starmer was calling this far right riots. It didn't feel like that to start with then. And that's what sort of piqued the curiosity. This didn't, feel like the traditional notion of a far right, at least. And we want to understand how exactly that happened, especially the interaction with what we were seeing online and on social media.
So no doubt that must have played a part in you wanting to find out the source of this misinformation. And it was all around the identity of the attacker, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it was the judge, one of the judges, when he was sentencing some of the people from Bristol, specifically cited this disinformation as why people are out on the street. And it did come very quickly down to the identity of the attacker, rumours that he was an immigrant who had come over to the UK on a small boat, and that he was on an MI6 watch list, none of which had any basis in reality.
I mean, they even named him Ali al-Shakati, and that was entirely nonsense, wasn't it?
Entirely nonsense, and just from nowhere. But that spread very, very quickly. There was obviously an absence of information, which is something that actually became an issue at the time. But it was because the alleged attacker was a child at the time, so there are very strict rules around what you can and can't say. But in that sort of information vacuum, this false information did spread, especially on X, but also on Telegram, which is what we were looking at.
I'm thinking back to that time, Tom. And look, the immediate assumption, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, calling it out as far right. And at that point, I think there was a broad assumption that this was being orchestrated by domestic individuals on that end of the political spectrum. Your Stephen Yaxley-Lennons or Tommy Robinsons, as you know.
Yeah, and there is certainly some of that. Like, there are big actors on Telegram and on X, and this is not to discount, because this is British people on the streets, British people getting arrested, British people getting convicted. But in terms of that online sphere, based on this research, this is an international movement in a way that it wasn't before. Before, you had very specific geographies when it came to, especially like anti-immigration organisations. So you think of based around London or based in the northeast, northwest, specific places with specific hierarchies, very command and control, and quite clandestine as well. Now, those still do exist in some form, but they are, by their nature, they have to be quite small. They're limited geographically, but what you do have is this big reach online and different ways for people to access that and jump onto that and get maybe sucked into a world through various different openings.
This was the point, I presume, that you started working with Pros. Explain exactly who they are.
Yeah, so Pros is an open source intelligence startup, and that might not sound like much.
I was going to say, you might actually have to explain most of the words in that phrase. Go on.
Open source intelligence is a lot of what the data and forensics team does here at Sky, and that is basically any sort of information that is openly available to anyone. Things like satellite imagery, we've used that a lot during the war between Russia and Ukraine, and of course between Israel and Hamas, and that sort of thing. Everyone can see that and draw their own conclusions from that. And it's the same thing that applies to social media. These are posts that are made in groups that, if you're in the group, is publicly available to anyone. So that's what Pros has in particular. They have this emphasis on Telegram.
You might have to explain, because even I'm not on Telegram, and I suspect many people who are on X/Twitter would not be on Telegram.
Yeah, it's definitely niche in the social media world. Messaging app, a bit like WhatsApp, that has channels like WhatsApp has now added. So you can have these channels with quite big followings, tens of thousands of people following it. But you can also have private chats too. So it's quite good both for organization and also for spreading a message and getting it out there. And if you're in the groups, you can see everything that's going on. So what Pros does, they're a startup. Al Baker there is the managing director. He's got this really amazing penetration really of the network. So monitors more than 10,000 groups on Telegram. And what happens every day, just archives everything that comes on. And it means when something happens, you can go back and look at it. So out of these 10,000, we found 1,000 groups that are really active around Southport. So on the day of the attack and then the 3 days after.
Can we characterise these accounts, these groups?
So when we're looking at these accounts, these are some of the most extreme things you'll find. We're talking proper neo-Nazis here. This isn't just a difference of opinion over whether lockdown should have happened. These are organised groups who are committed to a particular agenda. And there's lots of pro-Russian groups, for instance, in terms of pure propaganda. Again, that's not just expressing a view on the war in Ukraine. These are sort of putting out Kremlin talking points as their reason of being. So we are already looking at, the most extreme accounts.
Can we be specific about the numbers that we're talking about here? I mean, what kind of reach do they have?
Yeah, so in terms of Telegram is smaller than Twitter, X, and I think that is very important to realize. It's a lot more dedicated though. So when you're talking about some of the posts we talked around, sort of 500,000 views, that would be amongst the more influential. I would say because it is that more dedicated audience, it probably counts a lot in terms of someone has to send that on rather than the Twitter metric, the X metric of impressions or something. So it is certainly smaller than X, but we're talking thousands and thousands of messages with hundreds of thousands of views, millions between them eventually. And we've looked at the most influential.
So the assumption, as already mentioned, was that those who were fueling these riots came from the United Kingdom. And that's just not borne out by the investigation.
Yeah, and you look at this, the top 20 most, prolific, influential accounts in terms of how much their content got shared, how many conversations there were around it, and you can map all this in terms of those conversations, which is what we've done. Out of the top 20, only 6 of those were UK based. The rest were based abroad, so they're international accounts, the USA, Europe, and we were really struck by that. They weren't UK focused, and that sort of speaks to the nature, I think, of the new, right, really.
So, of course, this is the point at which, with your journalist hat on, you want to speak to some of these people, and that got you on a train to Strasbourg.
Strasbourg, delightful city. Never been before. And that was because Silvano Trotta, who's one of these influencers, accepted our invitation. We reached out to people, and he said, yeah, I'll be happy to speak with you.
What did you think was awaiting you at the other end?
Honestly, I had no idea. We've obviously done a bit of open source intelligence. He's a telecoms entrepreneur in Strasbourg on a business park outside there, successful business. I think sometimes when people think of what many would describe as conspiracy theorists, it's someone in a basement in a bit of a manky t-shirt, perhaps. He was very affable, very genial. Perspective is not what you expect. And I think the more stories we've done around this, the more you're really surprised by people.
He's clearly not an unintelligent man, a successful businessman working in telecoms.
Exactly. And I think that is actually, the more you look around these sort of fringes, the more you find is these are very intelligent people who've got a different view. And I think, everyone, of course, should have different views. It'd be horrible if we're all the same. But it's when it sort of goes off beyond things which are recognizably not even true. It's things that are completely unfalsifiable one way or the other, and you can't really argue with it. But again, he was very nice, offered coffee, took us through his views, was happy to talk about it. He was very charming. You can see why he's been a successful businessman, but his other passion is posting stuff like this, I would say, pretty regardless of the consequences. He had done this sort of pre-COVID, but then especially during COVID, he was very critical of a lot of the measures that were being introduced. It led to his accounts on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, as it was then called, being suspended.
Would you be able to describe him as an anti-vaxxer?
Yeah, I think he would sort of describe himself as a freedom lover. But yeah, skeptical of vaccines, certainly lockdowns, but also generally he's, questioned whether the moon is hollow, perhaps.
Sorry, what?
And yeah, so this
whether the moon is hollow?
Yeah, whether it's a natural body or not. And so he's not afraid of a controversial view. I think that's fair to say. And he would characterize himself as a very free thinker on that. He was one of these people who posted on Telegram about this fake name, Ali al-Shakati, and saying that he was a Muslim immigrant. And that got forwarded lots of times, one of the most influential posts. And I put it to him, this was obviously false. And, before we'd started talking, he described himself as a fighter against misinformation. And said, well, this is false. Why did you put it out there? Why is it still up? Because it's still available. And he said, look, hey, we all make mistakes. And I was just reposting my sources. But that's very much how he positions himself, is as a commentator. Look, I'm just commentating on the news. I see news. I put it out there. That's all that my role is within this. And a lot of people are sort of similar to that on X. It's just putting out views.
This is the I'm just asking questions brigade, as I like to call them.
Exactly, just asking questions. But what has changed is the narrative around what should, especially when it comes to Southport and like the vigil that happened the next day. What becomes a community's grief is rapidly morphing into something else. It's questions around immigration, around Islam, which the initial horror of that, the tragedy of that, didn't really have anything to support.
Tom, pause there. When we come back, we will be asking a very, very straightforward question. What have we learned about those riots, and how much can we plan to avoid those circumstances in the future? Welcome back to The Daily. Our data and forensics correspondent Tom Cheshire still walking us through the root causes of those riots this summer. Look, we've talked a lot about the investigation itself. Let's just sit back just a little. I suppose the main point is this was not homegrown to the extent that I certainly assumed.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to caveat that, if that's all right, because I think some of it is very homegrown in terms of, again, those people on the street. I think their concerns, I think a lot of these were anti-immigration protests that descended into riots, but I don't think they were necessarily members of the far right. But I think a lot of people were sort of carried away, and they might have very strong views anti-immigration, but they are not necessarily far right. I think what is different is online, there is a specific agenda, a specific network, which is trying to further far right talking points, agendas, and they see things like Southport as an opportunity.
Because we are at a point where increasingly this term far right is bandied around, and I do wonder just how useful it is. As previously mentioned, there are still the jackbooted idiots out there with swastika tattoos. That we're not denying that. But there are plenty of people who, and we've covered this on the podcast before, who were on those riots, who would say that they are certainly anti-mass immigration, but they are not racist, that they are not of the far right.
Exactly. And, the position of the Labour Party is that immigration is too high.
Yeah.
That is, I think it's perfectly possible to hold that viewpoint and say, and not be racist and not be far right. I think it's different when it comes to an agenda specifically around Islam, which we saw a lot around the riots in terms of the online discourse.
So is a better way of kind of characterising this situation that there is an exploitation of people with genuine concerns by what you would call the far right?
I think that's exactly the case. And that is something that has always been an issue. Actually, earlier this year, I was up at RAF Scampton, where they're building a big asylum centre, which has since actually been cancelled. And there'd been a protest camp around there for years. And the issue was that there were, again, people who were living close by who didn't want a big asylum centre next to a very small town. They're saying this is the wrong place for it. On the other hand, there were people with connections to traditional far-right organisations. They would come up and sort of try and garner that support, scoop it up with them. And I think that's what we've seen is sort of people seeing recruitment opportunities really, whether it is around COVID, anti-lockdown, anti-vax.
And I suppose this is a doubly timely bit of work by you and the rest of the team, in the sense that it was just in the past few days we've been hearing from the head of MI5 about the threat from, again, what we used to call the far right, but that it's rather more complicated now because it's what was the phrase he used, a pick and mix ideology.
Yeah, pick and mix, which makes it sound a bit more enjoyable than it actually is. Yeah, Ken McCullum, the head of MI5, he's talking about how the security services divide their time. And he was saying, the majority of threats they deal with is still Islamist terrorism, but around a third were far-right connected. He said the difficult thing when it comes to far-right, it's the same sort of issue that happened with the rise of IS in terms of this access to propaganda online and people self-radicalizing. He said a similar sort of thing is happening with people, especially teenagers and young people, when it comes to extreme right-wing ideology. And that is happening, he said, mainly through online sources. People join at different points. There's no obvious way in, but people are really, really getting into these groups. And it is mostly online that they find this stuff.
I mean, just as you were talking there, I'm wondering whether some of this stuff intersects with the kind of the men's rights stuff that we see in the misogyny in that area, the kind of the stuff that surrounds some populist politics in Europe and, of course, in the United States, where, the deep state is mentioned. This coming together of so many different ideas, which then everyone seems to share and hold on to.
I think you're exactly right. It is a broad church, and it's not to say that everyone subscribes to every view.
Of course not. Of course not.
I do think people do is they have a respect for people who dissent from what they would class as the establishment view, the mainstream media view.
Just asking questions.
Yeah, exactly. I'm awake, I'm seeing the world, and I might not agree on absolutely everything, but we have a shared viewpoint because it is anti-establishment, and it's very easy to find these groups online and feel like you're part of this community. And a smarter community, people who are more intelligent, who see the world as it really is, rather than everyone else who's blinkered and just goes along with the obvious point of view.
I just wonder then what can be done, if anything, actually, about the spread of disinformation, misinformation in what isn't an entirely unregulated space. There are regulations out there. I mean, who is more to blame? These individual actors, these individual accounts, or the social media companies for permitting it? I mean, have we been hearing from them?
Yeah, I mean, well, X didn't reply to us.
There's a shocker.
They tend not to these days, but at least they've stopped doing the poop emoji, which is what they just used to send back automatically. Telegram did reply to us, though, and they pointed out that they had removed lots of channels, and that is the case. You go on some of these channels and it says not available in the UK, or they've gone away, or some of them have shut themselves down. And Telegram also saying was happy to cooperate with authorities. Actually, as a result of that, there's a lot of distrust in these communities around Telegram now, precisely for that reason. Telegram would also make the point, and I think it is a fair one, that they don't have an algorithm in the same way that X does or Instagram does, in terms of it is just chat groups. You have to really try and find them, and it comes in chronological order. Stuff is not amplified or pushed to you based on your perceived taste by an algorithm.
And I suspect that there might even be state actors who are involved in this as well, who view occasions that will crop up in the future as an opportunity to stoke dissent on the streets of London, the streets of Birmingham, the streets of Southport, because why the hell not?
Yeah, I think that. Why not cause chaos? That suits a lot of countries around the world. We specifically looked at actually Russian accounts around this, and we didn't find a huge amount of sort of Russian activity on Telegram itself. But of course, people will take advantage of that, and these systems are very easy. The nature of democracy is it's open. The nature of these platforms is that they're open. So it's very easy to infiltrate and do this. Again, I don't want to go too far down it, because I do think people have to be sort of slightly upset about something, whether it's the state of the public realm or whatever, to go out on the street. They're not just going to see a tweet and it's going to radicalize them like that. They have to find fertile ground. So I think there's an interplay of factors there. But this is an online movement, especially with those guardrails off on X and on Telegram. They say they're increasing them, but where the sort of most extreme content does thrive and it makes its way and it finds an audience, whereas previously it may not have.
On the basis of what you've been saying then, Tom, this is going to happen again. I mean, look, we have seen figures on, if you want to call it the extreme right, trying to weaponize individual stories before. Grooming gangs come straight to mind, faith schools, that so on. But we haven't, in the aftermath of that spread of disinformation, misinformation, seen riots on the scale that we did this summer. I mean, you've gone so far as to describe Southport as a blueprint for the future.
And I think that is the case. If you look at these groups again, there's Al Baker at Pros saying, they're still watching these people, they're still there. And there's a lot of, as he characterizes it, recrimination, that this was an opportunity. And this is what he's talking about, the very hardcore here, who, the people who literally want to start a race war. And I think what they probably want to do in terms of organisation is try and make it stick more, right? It flared up. I think it was really good for that rapid reaction in a way. They didn't even know where the protests were going to be and would have been delighted. It was all over the country, from sort of Rotherham down to Bristol.
Are we now at a point where we can say that this term far right is largely, if not entirely, redundant? When it comes to the people that we have been talking about, the people that you have talked to, it doesn't feel like it's a label that has much utility when it comes to talking about someone like Silvana Trotta.
It's tricky though, isn't it? Because I think far right, you've got to have something further than right. I think the term on the opposite end of it is radical left or extreme left. So we could say extreme right, or we can say hard right. Populist right gets used a lot. I think far right encompasses all of those. We have to have some sort of word to try and just get that more extreme opinion. It is that political spectrum which is further than the mainstream right, I would say. I mean, I think a lot of it depends on the wider political situation, the economic situation. These things certainly do help. I think we also had a really traumatic event in COVID, and there's really good research on this that says, when you have these big traumas, it's a shock to the system. People try and make sense of the world in different ways, and you do get a lot of extremism in whatever form, whatever ideology as a result. So I think there's a slightly broken nature to where we are in terms of how we think, how we interact with each other. That is worrying, especially if it does translate to action on the streets.
Tom, many thanks. And for much more on Tom's journalism and that, of course, of the Data and Forensics Unit, just head to skynews.com. We'll see you on The Daily, same time tomorrow.